In 1761, a 17-year-old princess arrived at St. James's Palace to marry the King of England. Her name was Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She would bear 15 children, influence Georgian architecture, champion Mozart, and remain queen for 57 years. Her face appeared on coins, in state portraits, and in the national consciousness of an empire at its height. But here's what they never taught you. Within weeks of her arrival, courtiers began whispering about her appearance. Newspapers described features they found uncommon. Portrait painters received unusual instructions. And 6 generations back in her family tree, a genealogical line disappeared into silence. A line that connected her to a black branch of the Portuguese royal family. This is not speculation. This is documented. And for 2.5 centuries, the historical establishment has alternated between acknowledging it, erasing it, and pretending the question never existed. The question is not whether Queen Charlotte had African ancestry. The question is why that ancestry became unspeakable. Mecklenburg-Strelitz was not a powerful duchy. Small, Protestant, and financially modest, it occupied territory in what is now northern Germany. Charlotte's childhood was quiet, educated, and unremarkable by royal standards. She spoke German and French, played keyboard, and had been raised with the expectation that she would marry strategically, but not spectacularly. Then King George III of England needed a wife. He was 22, had just ascended the throne, and required a bride who was Protestant, fertile, politically neutral, and unconnected to the factional wars consuming the English aristocracy. Charlotte met every requirement. The courtship was conducted through intermediaries. They met for the first time on the day of their wedding. She spoke no English. He barely spoke German. It was September 8th, 1761. The wedding took place at night in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. Charlotte wore silver and white. George wore ceremonial dress. According to the official record, she was composed, obedient, and appropriately royal. The marriage was consummated, the succession was secured. This is the version taught in schools. But the contemporary accounts say something else. Horace Walpole, one of the most prolific diarists of Georgian England, described Charlotte's appearance as not handsome. He noted her nostrils spread too wide, her mouth large. He added, with unmistakable racial subtext, that she had a tinge in her complexion. Sir Walter Scott would later describe her as having a true mulatto face. The physician Baron Christian Friedrich Stockmar, who attended the court decades later, described her features as unmistakably African. These were not insults whispered in private. These were published observations by members of the aristocracy, recorded in diaries, letters, and memoirs that survive in archives today. Think about what this meant. A woman described in openly racial terms became queen of the most powerful empire on earth. And the historical record moved forward as if none of those descriptions existed. The genealogical evidence begins in the 15th century, 6 generations before Charlotte's birth. Her ancestral line connects to Margarida de Castro e Souza, a Portuguese noblewoman born in the 1400s. Margarida's family descended from King Alfonso III of Portugal and his mistress, Madrigana, a Moorish woman from the Algarve region. Some historians argue Madrigana was simply Moorish in the cultural sense, North African, but not necessarily sub-Saharan African. Others point to the Moors' well-documented African ancestry, particularly from the Berber and Arab populations that controlled Iberia for 7 centuries. The genealogical line from Madrigana to Charlotte has been traced by researchers including historian Mario de Valdez y Cocom, who published his findings in 1999 after years of archival work across Portugal, Germany, and England. The connection appears in multiple genealogical records, including the Machado de Vila Pouca de Aguiar archives and the records of the Portuguese royal house. But here's the critical detail. By the time this ancestry reached Charlotte, it had been folded into 6 generations of European nobility. Genetically, mathematically, her African heritage would have been distant, perhaps 1/512th if the calculations hold. A fraction nearly invisible by blood quantum standards. Except it was not invisible. Alan Ramsay painted Charlotte's official coronation portrait in 1762. The portrait shows a young woman with darker skin than was typical for Northern European royalty, a broad nose and full lips. It was displayed at court, reproduced in engravings, and circulated across the empire. No one objected. No one demanded it be repainted. The court accepted the portrait as accurate. Then something changed. Later portraits began to lighten her skin. By the 1770s, painters like Thomas Gainsborough depicted Charlotte with features far more in line with European aristocratic beauty standards. The Ramsay portrait remained in the royal collection, but it was no longer the dominant image. The lightened versions became the template. On paper, this looks like stylistic evolution, but the pattern tells a different story. When Princess Sophia Matilda of Gloucester, Charlotte's niece, was born in 1773, observers noted she resembled her aunt closely. Descriptions emphasized her dark complexion and uncommon features. The same language that had followed Charlotte now followed the next generation. But by the 1800s, those descriptions disappeared from public discourse. Family trees were redrawn. Genealogical records were summarized, edited, and republished, without the Madrigana line. This was not an accident. This was a pattern. The British aristocracy in the 18th century was obsessed with bloodline purity, but not in the way 21st century observers imagined. Race, as a fixed biological category, had not yet solidified into the form it would take during the height of empire. Blackness was acknowledged in degrees, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, but it was also fluid, negotiable, and dependent on power. Charlotte had power. She was queen. She produced heirs. She influenced policy, patronized the arts, and maintained the dignity of the crown through decades of George III's mental illness. Her position insulated her from the racial hierarchies that controlled everyone else. But that insulation was conditional. By the 1780s, the British Empire had become the largest trafficker of enslaved Africans in the world. Ships flying the British flag transported over 3 million Africans across the Middle Passage between 1750 and 1807. The Royal African Company, the South Sea Company, and independent slavers operated with crown approval, parliamentary backing, and financial investment from the aristocracy. Liverpool, Bristol, and London became wealthy beyond measure. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton flowed into Britain. Human beings flowed out. At the center of this empire sat Queen Charlotte. She did not own slaves herself. Slavery was illegal on English soil, a legal distinction that allowed the English to condemn slavery in principle while profiting from it in practice. But her household was funded by taxes on colonial trade, which included taxes on slave-produced goods. Her husband's government defended slavery in Parliament. Her sons grew up in a world where black people existed as either enslaved laborers abroad or curiosities in England. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. If Queen Charlotte had African ancestry, then the empire's racial logic collapsed. A black woman, or even a woman with distant African heritage, could not, by the empire's own ideology, sit at the top of the racial hierarchy. The system required her to be purely European, because anything else undermined the justifications for slavery, colonialism, and racial dominance. So the ancestry was buried, not through explicit decree, but through silence. Genealogists stopped tracing the Madrigana line. Historians stopped mentioning the contemporary descriptions. The portraits that depicted her with African features were moved out of prominent display. The Ramsay portrait remained in the royal collection, a kind of historical receipt, but it was not widely reproduced. The historical record became a selective archive. Meanwhile, Charlotte herself navigated the contradiction in silence. She never publicly acknowledged African ancestry. She never denied it. She performed her role as queen with precision, raising her children according to royal protocol, managing her household, and maintaining the image of European monarchy, even as her appearance suggested otherwise. In 1788, when George III suffered his first major episode of mental illness, Charlotte took on unprecedented power. She managed his care, consulted with physicians, and held the royal household together during a constitutional crisis. Parliament debated whether to install the Prince of Wales as regent. Charlotte's influence kept George on the throne. She was indispensable. But that indispensability came at a cost. To maintain her position, she had to accept the empire's racial logic. She could not challenge slavery. She could not acknowledge her ancestry. She could not destabilize the ideology that kept millions of black people in chains. In 1807, the same year the British Empire banned the transatlantic slave trade, Queen Charlotte turned 63. She had been queen for 46 years. The ban was celebrated as a moral triumph, a demonstration of British enlightenment. The abolitionist movement, led by figures like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, presented the decision as evidence of British humanity, but slavery itself continued. The ban applied only to the trade, not to the institution. British colonies in the Caribbean remained dependent on enslaved labor for another 26 years, and the royal family, whose bloodline may have connected them to the people they enslaved, said nothing. Queen Charlotte died on November 17, 1818, at Kew Palace. She was 74 years old. She had lived through the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the collapse of her husband's sanity. She had borne 15 children, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. She had been queen longer than almost anyone in British history at that point. Her funeral was a state event. The nation mourned. Newspapers published tributes. George III, by then completely incapacitated, was not told of her death. And then the historical record closed. Biographies published in the 19th century described Charlotte as a dutiful wife, a devoted mother, and a patron of the arts. They praised her charity work, her musical talent, and her management of royal finances. They did not mention her appearance. They did not trace her genealogy. They did not include the Ramsay portrait in their illustrations. The erasure was complete. For over a century, Charlotte's African ancestry was a non-issue, not because it had been proven false, but because it had been forgotten. History textbooks taught about her as a minor figure, a queen consort who existed in the shadow of her husband's madness. The Georgian era was remembered for its architecture, its literature, and its wars. Charlotte was a footnote. Then, in the mid-20th century, the silence broke. Historians began revisiting the contemporary accounts. Genealogists traced the Madrigana line again. Researchers examined the Ramsay portrait alongside later depictions and noted the dramatic differences. In 1940, historian J.A. Rogers published Sex and Race, which included a section on Queen Charlotte's possible African heritage. The claim was dismissed as fringe history, more curiosity than scholarship. But the question did not disappear. In 1999, historian Mario de Valdez y Cocom published a detailed genealogical study tracing Charlotte's ancestry through the Portuguese royal line to Madrigana. His research included archival documents, family trees, and contemporary descriptions. He argued that Charlotte's African ancestry was not only possible, but probable, and that the historical establishment had deliberately obscured it. The response was immediate and divided. Some historians embraced the findings. Others rejected them, arguing that the genealogical evidence was too distant, too speculative, and too dependent on assumptions about Madrigana's racial identity. The debate became a proxy war over how history should acknowledge race, ancestry, and the fluidity of identity in pre-modern Europe. But here is what no one disputed. Contemporary observers describe Charlotte in racial terms. The Ramsay portrait exists. The genealogical line from Madrigana to Charlotte is documented in multiple archives, and the historical record shifted its treatment of Charlotte's ancestry precisely as the British Empire solidified its racial ideologies. The pattern is undeniable. In 2020, the Netflix series Bridgerton reimagined Regency England with Queen Charlotte as a central figure, portrayed by a black actress. The show made no attempt to hide her race. It presented an alternate history where racial integration had occurred in the English aristocracy. The show was a global phenomenon. The response revealed how much the question still mattered. Historians debated the accuracy. Some praised Bridgerton for bringing attention to Charlotte's possible ancestry. Others criticized it for conflating fiction with history. The conversation became a lightning rod for broader debates about representation, historical accuracy, and who gets to decide what counts as real history. But the show did something the historical establishment had never done. It put Charlotte's blackness at the center of the story. In 2023, a Bridgerton prequel series focused entirely on Queen Charlotte's life, depicting her arrival in England, her marriage to George III, and her navigation of a racially stratified society. The show acknowledged the ambiguity, the genealogical distance, and the historical debate. It presented Charlotte as a woman caught between identities, unable to claim blackness without destabilizing the empire, unable to deny it without erasing herself. That tension is the truth. Queen Charlotte's ancestry may have been fractional, but it was documented. Contemporary observers saw it. Portrait painters depicted it. And for 2 centuries, the historical establishment chose silence over acknowledgement. This is not a story about whether Charlotte was really black. By modern American racial standards, she would not have been. By 18th century British standards, the question would have been complicated by class, power, and proximity to the throne. But this is a story about erasure. It is a story about how history selectively remembers and strategically forgets. It is a story about how the British Empire, which enslaved millions of Africans, could not acknowledge that African ancestry might exist in its own royal bloodline. It is a story about how blackness, even in trace amounts, becomes unspeakable when it threatens the logic of white supremacy. And it is a story that repeats. Across Europe, across the Americas, across the world, there are genealogical lines that connect power to blackness, lines that were buried, rewritten, or erased. Alessandro de' Medici, the Duke of Florence, was of African descent. Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet, was the great-grandson of an enslaved African. Dido Elizabeth Bell, a mixed-race woman, was raised in the English aristocracy. Their stories exist, but they exist in fragments, footnotes, and contested archives. The pattern is not unique to Queen Charlotte. The pattern is systemic. And the fact that we are still debating whether Charlotte had African ancestry, still arguing over genealogies, still questioning portraits, still measuring blood quantum, reveals how much power the erasure still holds. Because the question was never really about Charlotte. It was about whether history could afford to acknowledge that the lines between black and white, enslaved and free, subject and sovereign, were never as fixed as the empire needed them to be. Queen Charlotte died in 1818, but the question of her ancestry did not die with her. It was buried, and then, centuries later, it resurfaced. Because the truth always does.